Alright, welcome everyone. Welcome back to our series on transport in humans. Now, in our previous set of videos, we looked at the structure of the heart. So now we are finally ready to talk about how blood flows through the heart. So we can use our knowledge of all the different structures of the heart to give a good, detailed explanation of how blood flows through the heart. Now you can find that on in your textbook on page 162 for pure bio students. And you must go and read this page in the textbook before watching this video. So putting that textbook page together with this video will give you a very strong understanding of how blood passes through the heart. And the outcome at the end of this is that you need to be able to describe it in detail, in accurate biological detail, how blood moves through the heart. Alright, so let's get going, and we're going to start with a video. So as you watch this video, I want you to just get an idea of what are the main steps, the main sequence of events as blood flows through the heart.
If we inject dye into the superior vena cava, you can watch it pass through the heart as it goes through the cardiac cycle. The blood first enters the heart into the right atrium. A contraction of the right atrium then forces blood through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, the muscular force pushes blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary artery. The blood then travels to the lungs where it receives oxygen. Next, it drains out of the lungs via the pulmonary veins and travels to the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood is forced through the mitral valve into the critically important left ventricle. The left ventricle is the major muscular pump that sends the blood out to the body systems. When the left ventricle contracts, it forces the blood through the aortic semilunar valves and into the aorta. From here, the aorta and its branches carry blood to all the tissues of the body.
Right, so that's the video. Hopefully you managed to catch some of it. It's quite fast, so if you need to, watch it again. Otherwise, let's go on and let's move on to how do we actually describe this in words. Alright, so let's start with the description. Now you realize that there's a lot of helping words given here, so that you just really need to only fill in the blanks. However, in the exam, these helping words will not be there, and you will need to know how to describe this entire process by yourself. Now it might look very difficult, but what's important is you need to understand the sequence of events. One event will naturally lead to another event. So if you understand the sequence well and have a picture of it in your head, actually this will not be too difficult. Okay, with that, let's have a go. Alright, so we're going to start our description up here. Here, deoxygenated blood from the whole body is returned to the right atrium, right, this chamber here, through the superior and inferior vena cava. Right, this is the superior vena cava, which brings deoxygenated blood from the upper half of the body, and the inferior vena cava, which brings deoxygenated blood from the lower half of the body into the right atrium. Okay, so it comes up behind the heart. You can't really see the back part of it here. Next, the right atrium here will contract, and this will generate some pressure. It will cause this tricuspid valve to open. Right, so it will cause the tricuspid valve to open, and blood will then flow into the right ventricle over here, as shown by the arrows. Next, the right ventricle will contract and generate pressure. Now, when the right ventricle contracts, the tricuspid valve will close. The tricuspid valve will close. And this is to prevent backflow of blood into the right atrium. So blood is already, this ventricle will contract, and you don't want blood to go back this way. You only want it to move out this way. So blood will then flow into the pulmonary arteries to be transported to the lungs. Now later on, the right ventricle will relax And when it relaxes, the pressure inside the ventricle will decrease. So in order to prevent blood from flowing back into the right ventricle, this semilunar valve will close. Okay, so the semilunar valve here will prevent the backflow of blood back into the right ventricle. Okay, so this is the events that take place in the right side of the heart. Now let's take a look when blood comes back to the heart from the lungs. Alright, so now oxygenated blood from the lungs returns to the left atrium, right, through the pulmonary veins, okay, to the left atrium. The left atrium will contract and generate pressure. This opens up the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. Right, it will open up and blood will then flow into the left ventricle over here. Next, the left ventricle will contract and will generate pressure. And to prevent backflow of blood into the left atrium, this bicuspid valve will close to prevent backflow of blood from the left ventricle to the left atrium. Now, when the left ventricle contracts, blood will flow into the aorta, right, this blood vessel here, the aorta, to be transported to all parts of the body. Later on, when the left ventricle relaxes, the semilunar valves, right, so the semilunar valve, the blood flows out of the aorta. The semilunar valve over here will prevent backflow of blood back into the left ventricle when it relaxes. And that is how blood flows through the heart. Alright, so let's have a summary of what we've already seen. So we've seen that we start with deoxygenated blood coming back to the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood passes into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. And from the right ventricle, blood is pumped out to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs to pick up oxygen. After blood picks up oxygen, oxygenated blood comes back into the heart through the pulmonary veins. From the pulmonary veins, it enters the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood is pumped into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, blood is pumped into the aorta, and then it is distributed to the rest of the body. So that's the summary. And now the part that people usually find quite difficult to remember is, how do I remember that the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve, which side is it on? Now, one helpful way that I found is to remember this phrase: you try that it is right before you buy it. Right? You always want to try that something is working right before you buy it, right? So if you start with the deoxygenated blood going to the heart, the blood will pass through the tricuspid valve on the right side of the heart before it passes through the bicuspid valve. Okay, so tricuspid on the right and then bicuspid later on. So if you remember this sequence, just remember try it that it is right before you buy it. Or the other way that people remember it is they remember that they write the tricycle before they write a bicycle. Right? So it's always the tri first before the bi, if we start with deoxygenated blood entering the heart. Now, one question that you might have at this point is, does this mean that during one heartbeat, the right atrium contracts first, then the right ventricle contracts, then the left atrium contracts, then the left ventricle contracts? Does the heart contract in a 4-part series? That means this one, boop, this one, boop, this one, boop, this one, boop. Is that correct? So in order to find out, let's watch this very short video. So what do you observe about the way that the heart beats? Which chambers contract together? Well, hopefully you realize that this idea here is not exactly right. It's not that the right atrium contracts first, then the right ventricle, then the left atrium, then the left ventricle. Instead, we notice that the atria contract together and the ventricles contract together. Right? Take a look again. You can see that the atria contract together, right? And then the ventricles also contract together. Alright, so this is actually quite important, and we describe this later on in the next video as part of the cardiac cycle. Alright, so if you go back again to this kind of description that we just had, where we describe the flow of blood through the heart, you'll actually realize that, two things are happening at the same time. In one heartbeat, deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium at the same time that oxygenated blood enters the left atrium. This is happening together. Even though we describe it in a sequence, these two events are actually happening together. And then the right atrium and the left atrium contract together. Right? These two things happen together. And we call this phase of the heartbeat the atrial systole. We'll talk more about this in the next video. Systole means contract. Okay? So both atria contract together. We call this the atrial systole. So then blood moves from the atria into the ventricles, right? And this happens together again. Now, next phase is when the ventricles contract. Now, the right ventricle and the left ventricle contract together as well. And this we call the ventricular systole. Alright, so ventricular meaning ventricles and systole meaning contract. They contract together and pump blood out into their respective blood vessels. So blood will flow into the pulmonary artery and into the aorta at the same time. And finally, both ventricles will relax together, right? Also together with the atria. So the atria and the ventricles will all relax at the end. And there's a name for this. Later on you'll see. It's called diastole. Right? They both relax and blood will again then flow into the atrium, from the body and from the lungs into the atrium. Alright, so this slide is just to show you that even though we describe it in this sequence, and you should describe it in this sequence, that actually there are pairs of events happening at the same time. Alright, so importantly, both atria contract together, both ventricles contract together, and then finally both atria and ventricles relax together. Alright, we'll talk more about this in the next video when we go into the cardiac cycle.